They say the sun hits different out in the Arizona territory, where the earth drinks light like it's dying of thirst. That summer of 1871, it scorched the ground dry and bleached the bones of cattle and men alike. It was the kind of summer where trouble bakes slow in the heat, till it cracked open like a busted seed pod. Clara Langford didn't belong out there, not by blood or by boots. She was high society bred, Boston raised, piano trained, corset stitched. But on the morning of what should have been her wedding to one Mr. Thaddeus Wentworth III, she slipped out the back door of the Langford estate, laced up her softest shoes, and vanished like dew before sunrise. Some say she rode off with a stable boy. Others swore she took a train west with a gambler and a grin. Truth was, Clara didn't have a destination in mind, just a direction. West, toward a sky that never ended and a life that hadn't yet begun. She traded her lace gloves for a pair of sun-bleached workman's mitts in Santa Fe, swapped her bustle for buckskin in Tucson, and by the time she made it to the Arizona hills near the San Carlos Apache land, she was more dust than debutante. That's where she met him. His name was DeSoto Hay, though the settlers and cavalry called him Hawk. He was Apache, tall, lean, with eyes like storm-washed stone. He moved quiet, spoke less, and watched her like a hawk indeed. Curious, cautious, and always ready to bolt. Their meeting was chance, a busted canteen, a dry creek bed, and Clara near collapse from heat and foolish pride. He gave her water. She gave him her name. And that, old friend, is how a high-society runaway bride came to share shade with an Apache warrior. Clara didn't go back. She couldn't. Hawk took her to his people, reluctantly at first. She was pale, strange, and her tongue clumsy with their words. The elders frowned. The women whispered. But Hawk's mother, a woman whose spine was straight as an arrow shaft, saw something in Clara's stubbornness. Maybe it was the way she stood with her shoulders square even when her feet bled, or how she listened, really listened, when the others spoke. The summer sun burned on, merciless as always, but in Hawk's world Clara found a rhythm, tending to goats, grinding maize, gathering mesquite pods. She'd never worked so hard in her life, nor felt so alive. Her hands toughened, her back ached, but her heart, that thing she thought she'd left behind in Boston, beat steady again. Then came the night of the thunder moon. The cavalry rode through the valley like a wildfire, looking for a band of raiders who'd taken rifles from a trader's post 2 towns over. They weren't interested in who was innocent or not. They saw Clara, white dressed in deerskin, and thought the worst. It was Hawk who stepped between her and the muzzle of that rifle. No words, just action, just love, though he'd never said it plain. The bullet grazed his side, left him bleeding in the dust. Clara screamed, and the desert held its breath. She saved him, stitched him up with trembling hands, nursed him through fever with water and whispered prayers. And when he opened his eyes, he looked at her like a man who'd seen heaven and hell and chose to come back. They were married the next morning, beneath the rising sun, with nothing but the desert and the wind as witnesses. But Hawk's world, his real world, wasn't all sunsets and slow smiles. There were rules, enemies, and scars buried deep. Clara had stepped into a life full of thorns and silence, and before long, she'd learn. Surviving love is one thing. Surviving a world that don't want you to belong, that's another trail altogether. The morning after their wedding, the world looked different. Not brighter, not sweeter, just heavier, like a storm cloud hanging overhead that hadn't made up its mind yet. Hawk moved slower than usual, wincing when he stretched too far, but he was alive. That counted for something. Clara tried to smile, tried to make the fire dance the way the elder women did, tried to carry her water without spilling a drop. But there was no pretending anymore. She wasn't just a guest. She was one of them now, in name if not yet in truth. And that meant everything she did, everything she was, would be judged harder than before. The younger braves didn't speak to her. The older women watched like hawks. Even the children, once curious, now hung back. Hawk's mother, Naya, was the only one who still treated Clara like she belonged, but even she grew quieter as days stretched on. Clara began to understand. Her being there was a risk, not just to herself, but to them all. See, the territory was crawling with soldiers, scouts, and bounty hunters. And folks like Clara, runaways, outcasts, white women who got lost. They stirred trouble just by breathing. Word was already spreading beyond the canyons. The story grew with every telling. A white woman kidnapped by savages. A chief's son betting a settler's daughter. A scandal wrapped in fear and fed to the flames of hate. The first warning came from a scout named Old Red, half Shoshone, half Coyote, if you believe the tales. He rode into the camp one evening, his pony thin and his eyes sharp. "They know she's here," he said to Hawk, not even glancing Clara's way. "A patrol passed through San Miguel yesterday, asking questions, flashing warrants. You got maybe 3 days." 3 days. That night, Clara sat with Hawk on a flat rock beneath the stars. The sky above them stretched wide and endless, full of light and silence. She leaned into him, feeling the weight of his arm around her shoulders, the rhythm of his breath. "I never wanted this to be your fight," she whispered. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "You are my wife. That makes it mine." She wanted to cry, but tears felt selfish. So instead, she held his hand and traced the lines of his palm like they were a map home. Come morning, the elders gathered. Hawk stood before them, tall and proud despite the bandage on his side. Clara stood just behind him, heart pounding like a war drum. "They will not stop," Hawk said. "Even if we give her up, they will come again. And again." An old man with eyes like river stones nodded slowly. "Then she must learn. Become one of us. In truth." So it began. They taught her the tongue, not the broken words she'd picked up, but the deep language of the earth and spirits. She learned to weave, to hunt rabbits with snares, to mix sage and juniper for wounds. She learned to ride bareback, to read the land by the way shadows moved. And slowly, grudgingly, the people began to accept her. But the days were running out. The riders came on the 4th day. Dust on the horizon. 7 men, blue coats and carbines, with one in civilian dress. Her would-be husband, Thaddeus Wentworth III. He'd crossed half a continent, with his pride dragging behind him like a busted wheel. His mustache was waxed, his boots clean, but his eyes were desperate. "Clara," he called, standing just outside the camp. "Clara Langford, by the authority of the territory and her family, I demand her return." Clara stepped forward, shoulders squared, the desert wind in her hair. She wore no dress, no pearls, just soft buckskin, her braid long, and her hands calloused. "I ain't yours to demand," she said, voice steady as the cliffs. The silence that followed stretched taut. Then Thaddeus's face turned red, and he spat. "They'll hang you for this, you know. Him too. You've lost your mind." "No," she said, her voice quiet now. "I've finally found it." The man in the blue coat stepped forward, hand near his pistol. Hawk stepped between them, bow in hand, arrow nocked. It was about to turn bloody. But then, Naya stepped out, calm as ever, and spoke in English for the first time Clara had ever heard. "You leave now," she said, eyes like iron. "Next time, it won't be warnings." And somehow, whether it was the way she stood or the way the desert seemed to hold its breath, the men turned and left. For now. But Clara knew it wasn't over. It never was. After the bluecoats and Thaddeus disappeared over the horizon, the camp exhaled, but not in relief. No, it was the breath a man takes before diving underwater, knowing the surface ain't coming back quick. Hawk knew it. Clara knew it. The others just didn't say it out loud. That night, the fire burned low. Hawk carved an arrowhead from obsidian, while Clara tended to the younger children, showing a boy how to twist willow bark into cordage. She smiled, but it was a hollow thing, like a lantern lit with no oil. She hadn't seen the last of Thaddeus. Not by a long shot. Come dawn, Old Red returned with grim tidings. They're mustering in Fort Thomas. 24 riders, maybe more. Word is, they're not coming to talk. There weren't many choices. They could run, scatter into the high cliffs, take to the canyons, hide in the ghost veins of the old mining roads. But Hawk was a proud man, and more than that, a leader now. His father had passed during the smallpox years. Now folks looked to him. Running wouldn't just be cowardice, it'd be surrender. So he stood in front of the council that morning, and said what needed saying. "We don't run," Hawk declared. "We make them regret every step they take into our land." Clara stood beside him. She wasn't trained for battle, but she'd learned plenty since running west. She could shoot, well enough to scare, maybe kill. But more than that, she understood something Hawk did not: the minds of men like Thaddeus. "They're coming for me," she said. "Not you. They'll dress it up with words like justice and law, but I'm their real prize. I ran from them, and worse, I chose you." A heavy silence followed. Clara looked Hawk in the eye. "Let me go." He didn't even flinch. "No." "Then let me bait them." Now that he considered, a plan was born under the wide-open sky, drawn in the dirt with sticks and marked by stones. Clara would ride out alone, drawing them into a false sense of security, led them into Black Vulture Canyon, where the ridges rose like jagged teeth and sound disappeared into the stone. There Hawk and his best scouts would be waiting, not for parley, but for ambush. It was dangerous. Foolish, some said, but war don't favor the safe and the slow. So 2 days later, Clara mounted a painted Mustang and rode south, dust trailing behind her like a wedding veil made of earth. Her rifle was tucked under her leg. Her knife was hidden in her boot. And her heart, it beat steady, full of more grit than fear. She found Thaddeus, just outside Cedar Hill, camped with his men in a grove of cottonwoods. His face lit up when he saw her, as if he'd caught a runaway prize pig instead of a woman who'd rather kiss a rattlesnake. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look what the desert dragged back." "I've come willingly," Clara said, keeping her voice low, steady. "No bloodshed." He grinned. "That depends on Hawk, doesn't it?" She nodded, masking her fury. "Then let me talk to him. He's just over the ridge. Let me bring him in quiet." Thaddeus looked at her long and hard, then gave the nod. "5 men with you. No tricks." Clara turned her horse and led them into the mouth of the canyon. The sun was climbing now, beating down like a hammer. The shadows of the canyon swallowed them whole. She gave the signal, a flick of her reins, and from the rocks above, arrows rained down like justice itself. The ambush was swift, brutal, clean. The first 3 men fell without so much as a cry. The 4th turned tail, but a rope trap took his horse from under him. Only Thaddeus remained, scrambling up the side of the canyon like a desperate rat. Clara was the one who caught him. She rode hard, cutting him off before he could reach the ridge. He raised his revolver, but she was faster. The bullet caught him in the thigh, and he crumpled to the dust, cursing. You don't know what you've done," he shouted, face twisted in pain. Clara dismounted, her rifle still aimed. "I know exactly what I've done," she said, voice cold as creek stone. "I chose my place in this world, and it ain't next to you." Hawk appeared behind her, silent and strong. They tied Thaddeus to his own saddle, sent him and his wounded pride back to Fort Thomas, alive but beaten, by a woman in buckskin and a warrior with blood that remembered every injustice. The canyon lay behind them, but the silence had birthed road with Clara and Hawk, like a second shadow. The kind of quiet that ain't peace exactly, more like the space between thunderclaps, when the air's still shaking. Thaddeus had been sent back to Fort Thomas, with his pride limping and his leg worse off. The message was clear: Clara Langford wasn't property. Not anymore. She'd chosen her place, and it was among the people who lived by grit, not gold. But the world don't let a woman like her disappear so easy. Back in the village, there was celebration. Not loud. Apache folk didn't shout joy the way some settlers did, but it was there. In the sharing of roasted agave, in the nods from men who hadn't spoken to Clara before, in the way the children started inching closer to her fire at night. Hawk smiled more, though just with his eyes. The 2 of them found a kind of rhythm, hauling water, drying meat, sleeping under a roof of stars and cedar poles. They didn't talk about love. Didn't need to. Their hands said enough when they touched. Their silences spoke louder than any vows ever could. But the world was changing. Scouts came with news. Rail lines creeping west like steel snakes. Miners tearing into sacred lands, and soldiers getting bolder. Hawk's people were tired. Fewer game. Shorter summers. And more white flags that turned red too quick. One morning, Naya called Clara to her hut. The old woman sat on a woven mat, grinding seeds with worn hands. Her eyes, still sharp, studied Clara like a hawk circles a wounded rabbit. Not cruel, just curious. "You've taken a path that bends," she said, "but the trail ahead is steep. Are you still strong enough to walk it?" Clara nodded, though her heart fluttered. "Good," Naya said, "because you carry more than yourself now." Clara blinked. I don't understand." Naya smiled, thin and knowing. "You will." Later that day, Clara sat by the river, washing linen in the cool shallows. The breeze carried the scent of mesquite smoke and wild sage, and as she looked up at the clouds drifting lazy over the canyon rim, she felt it, the same way you feel a storm long before the sky darkens. She was late, a week, maybe more. The realization hit her not like lightning, but like a slow, rising flood. A child. Hawk found her there, hands motionless in the water, face pale despite the sun. When she told him, he didn't speak. Just dropped to one knee in the shallows and rested his forehead against her belly, arms wrapped around her like she was the last fire in a cold world. But not all news brings joy for long. 2 nights later, the village dogs howled. Not the bark of warning, but the long, mournful sound that comes when something shifts in the world. Old Red came riding hard out of the night. "They're building a new fort near the Salt River," he said, "closer than any before. They'll sweep this valley by fall." Hawk's jaw tightened. He stood quiet a long moment, then spoke. "We'll leave." The council argued, but Hawk's word held weight. They'd seen the writing in the sand. Clara watched as her husband transformed again. Not just warrior, not just husband, but leader. Preparations began at dawn. They would head east, toward the Mogollon Rim, where pine forests gave better shelter and the cavalry rarely rode. It would be a hard journey, especially for Clara, but she never flinched. She packed what little they owned. Naya gave her a pouch of dried herbs and a carved amulet. "For strength," she said. Before leaving, Clara walked alone to a high ridge overlooking the desert, the same place she'd first seen Hawk, battered by sun and fate. The place where she decided not to run. "I'm not that woman anymore," she whispered to the wind. "But she made me strong." Behind her, Hawk waited with 2 horses. One for now, and one for later. As they rode into the dawn, Clara felt the child stir within her, just a flutter, like the first breath of wind before a summer storm. And so they rode, not to escape, but to endure. They rode eastward for 7 days, and 7 dust-choked nights. The sun easing its fury only as they climbed higher into the hills. The air cooled, pine trees thickened, and the ground softened underfoot. Hawk led the band, 15 souls in all, Clara at his side, wrapped in a wool shawl that once belonged to Hawk's sister, now buried beneath desert stone. Clara's belly had just begun to round, only noticeable if you looked close. But Hawk noticed everything. The Mogollon Rim rose before them like the edge of the world, a wall of green and shadow stretching across the horizon. They set up camp in a small clearing by a stream, hidden by rock and timber. The wind smelled of wet bark and sweet grass. It was the first time in weeks Clara truly breathed deep. But even in such a place, peace is just a fragile shell. One morning, Hawk returned from a scouting trip with a frown that didn't reach his mouth. It lived behind his eyes. "White men in the woods," he said. "Trappers, maybe. Maybe worse." Clara tensed. "Do they know we're here?" "Not yet." Hawk posted scouts. Clara helped Naya, and the women set up smoke-free fires and camouflage netting. They'd done this before. A life lived in the margins teaches you how to vanish like a shadow at high noon. That night, under a sky choked with stars, Hawk sat with Clara by the fire. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, voice low. She shook her head. "Back to what? A piano and a cage?" "No, Hawk. I'm freer here, chased, hunted, afraid, but freer." He smiled then, a real one, and for a moment, all that weight they carried seemed lighter. But the reprieve didn't last. On the 4th morning, they found the signs. Fresh boot prints near the river, broken brush in a pattern too deliberate for deer. Hawk's expression hardened. Clara stood beside him, a hand to her belly. "We stay?" she asked. He hesitated. No. We move. Tonight. By moonrise, the group was packed. The children carried bundles twice their size. The old walked slow but steady. Clara's breath grew shorter as they climbed, but she said nothing. The baby kicked beneath her ribs, like it knew danger, walked close behind. They were nearly out of the gorge when the first shot rang out. Sharp. Clean. A warning, or a promise. Chaos followed. Screams. Dust. The whinny of horses. Hawk shouted orders. Clara dove behind a boulder, her heart hammering like a war drum. Bullets split the night. One of the scouts fell, his cry snatched by the wind. Hawk fired back, arrow after arrow, moving like a ghost between trees. Clara pulled her rifle from its saddle scabbard. Her hands trembled, but she steadied herself, aimed at movement between the trees, and fired. A grunt, then silence. Time slowed. The attackers, maybe a dozen, realized too late that this wasn't some fleeing band of beggars. These were warriors, mothers, survivors. The ambush turned. Fire returned fire. One by one, the invaders fell or fled. When the dust settled, 3 of Hawk's people lay dead, 5 more wounded. And Clara stood like a flame that refused to die out. Hawk came to her, eyes wide with concern. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, "but I'm done hiding." He nodded. "So am I." They buried the dead beneath pine and stone. No prayers, just silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. Later, Hawk carved something into a tree trunk, Apache glyphs, marking the ground as sacred as claimed. Clara touched the bark when he was done. "You know they'll come again." "I know," he said, "but next time, we won't be running." They had faced death and held the line. Together. Summer rolled on, hotter and meaner now. Up high near the Mogollon Rim, the wind carried the scent of pine and dry lightning, the kind of weather that whispers of fire before it dares show flame. The camp had grown quiet, not with fear, but with something heavier resolve. Hawk led like a man with a purpose carved into his soul. Clara followed, her belly now round enough to silence the last doubters. She had become more than just Hawk's bride. She was kin now. But the land, it don't care who loves who. The land gives, and the land takes. The soldiers came again, not with thunder, but with smoke. It started with a scout, face black with soot, stumbling into camp with eyes wide and voice hoarse. "South Ridge is burning." By the time Hawk and Clara crested the bluff, the sky was no longer blue. It glowed orange, an angry kind of glow, not the gentle kind of sunset. A fire was coming. Set, not sparked. Clara saw it in the soldiers' boot prints near the canyon rim, in the way the flames moved against the wind, not with it, controlled, deliberate. "They mean to smoke us out," she said. Hawk's jaw tightened. "Or burn us alive." A choice had to be made. Flee downhill where the smoke choked the trail, or climb higher toward the old ridge trail, steep and near forgotten. "We take the ridge," Hawk decided. It was a hard climb, especially for Clara. Her every step was like hauling stone. But she didn't complain. She gritted her teeth and pressed onward, the pain in her back a drumbeat matching the baby's kicks. The fire gained on them. Trees snapped in the heat, wind turned cruel, and smoke wrapped round their throats like a noose. That's when the trail gave out. A rock slide, fresh, likely deliberate, blocked the narrow pass. Behind them, fire. Ahead, stone and sky. Folks began to panic. But Clara didn't. She turned to the children, knelt beside them. "We don't stop. We climb." With Hawk's help, she was first up the rock face, showing the way like a flame bearer in the dark. One by one, they followed. By dawn, the fire had scorched the valley below, but the people were safe, tucked into a high meadow with spring water and ash on their clothes. That's when Clara collapsed. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She just sank to her knees, the pain sharp and sudden. Hawk was beside her in a heartbeat. "Clara." She looked up at him, eyes wet but smiling. "The baby, it's time." There was no doctor, no bed, just a cloak on pine needles and Naya's steady hands. The labor was long, fierce, like everything about Clara's journey. But come sunset, a cry split the still air. A baby girl, half Apache, half Boston, all fire. Hawk held her like she was the first star ever born. Clara, pale but smiling, reached for the child. "She's ours," she whispered. "Not theirs. Never theirs." The others gathered round, quiet, reverent. A new life. A promise born in fire. That night, Hawk stood watch while Clara slept, the baby nestled against her chest. He held his bow in one hand, his free hand resting lightly on the stone beside them. He didn't sleep. Didn't need to. Some men protect with guns, others with law. But Hawk, he protected with love. The high meadow cradled them for 3 more weeks. Summer waned but held on tight, the air dry and sweet with blooming clefros. Life settled into a rhythm again, one Clara had never imagined for herself. She woke each morning with the baby's breath warm against her collarbone, Hawk beside her, quiet and steady as ever. They named the child Nalin, Apache for maiden, though Clara liked to think it meant more: beginning, defiance, dawn. The others worked the land, mended bows, patrolled the ridges. The soldiers hadn't returned, not yet, but no one believed they were gone for good. One evening, as shadows stretched long and golden, Clara walked alone to the overlook. From there she could see the valley far below, the blackened trees, the scorched grass. A scar, permanent and deep. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Hawk found her there, his moccasins silent on the rock. "They'll come again," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara nodded. "I know." He turned to her. "And when they do, I won't run." "Neither will I." That night, a vote was held. The elders sat in a circle, the fire crackling like old bones. They spoke of migration, of the old ways. Some wanted to scatter, go north. Others, led by Hawk, wanted to stay. "This land is ours," he said, "not because we claim it, but because we bled for it. We raise our children here, not in exile, not in shame." And so it was decided. They would not move. They would build. The next day, they started clearing land. Clara, babe strapped to her chest, worked beside them. She learned to shape adobe, to plant beans and corn. She taught the children how to write their names in the dirt, how to hum lullabies from both sides of her world. Nalin grew strong, her laughter like a spark in dry kindling. But the world doesn't forget, nor does it forgive. One morning, a rider appeared on the edge of the woods. Not a soldier, not Thaddeus. A scout. He bore a letter, stamped, sealed, and reeking of government. It offered terms: protection, rations, a reservation downriver, a cage with softer walls. Hawk burned it. That night, Clara lay awake, the baby dozing in her arms. "Do you regret it?" she asked Hawk softly. He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Only that we didn't meet sooner." She smiled, eyes damp. "I used to dream of marble halls, ballrooms, gowns. But this is more than I ever dared hope for." Outside, the stars wheeled above, vast and bright. Come the end of that summer, when the first frost kissed the leaves and the wind turned whisper cold, Clara stood tall among her people, no longer an outsider, no longer running. The town of Langford back east never knew what became of her. Rumors floated, abduction, madness, scandal. But the truth lived on the windswept ridge, where fire once raged and life returned stronger, where a high society bride became a mother, a warrior's wife, and a legend, where love, like the land, endured,